What's up creators, I hope you're doing well. Today we're returning to the Edge-like series. We're going to try to replicate the style from Satoshi Inoue, also known as Metaphor 472. So this style is quite interesting in the sense that it only focuses on BlueHour photography, and it was a suggestion by one of you guys by Fair in the comment section on a previous video. So again, if you have any other videos that you want me to make or suggestions, put it down in the comment section and I'll check them out. So you know how this works. First of all, we're going to analyze a couple of images taken by Satoshi and break down the style so we know what we need to do when we jump into Lightroom, edit a photo and create a preset out of it. So creators, here you have Satoshi's profile, Satoshi Inoue or Metaphor _472 on Instagram if you want to go and support him. Down here, you can find the link to his website where he also sells his presets. So just as a reminder that if you're watching this video with the only purpose of achieving his style, the best way to do it is just to go and buy directly from him the product. Remember that I don't have access to those presets, so I don't know exactly what he does. And the purpose of my tutorials is just to learn how to color grade. We're just using the profiles of these famous creators. For example, he has 126,000 followers as an example to generate the exercise and to fine-tune our abilities when we're editing photos. Now, having said that, let's jump into the analysis. Now, first of all, if we take a broader look at his feed, we can notice that most of the images, if not all of them, are shot at blue hour. In other words, when the sun has just set. So we're still getting a bit of light from the remnants of the light in the sky, but in general, we're going to have a very blue temperature in our image. Not to be confused with golden hour, which is when the sun is just above the horizon and we're getting a very orangey look. In this case, it's very blue. So we need to shoot in that time of day to replicate his look. Okay, creators. So first of all, let's talk about what he does in the exposure and contrast, because right here, what I'm looking at is a very flat looking exposure. What I mean by this is that he's reducing the contrast on our image by raising up the shadows, so we have more detail and dark points on our image, and reducing a bit of the highlights, so they're in an even playing field, creating a flat looking image. So normally in blue hour, we would lose a lot of information in the shadows because it's a dark time of day. In these images, quite the opposite, we have a lot of detail in the dark points on our image. Also, pay attention how the blacks are non-existent in our image. The blacks are completely grayed out, washed out, and this, you're gonna do it in the tone curve or in the basic corrections. Then when it comes to the color grading, I don't see any weird changes, and maybe there is a bit of emphasis into the colors for the sunset, the magentas and the purples, and the blues in the sky are a bit more towards the magenta side, not towards the teal side. So I have to keep that in mind, but due to the time of day, we're not gonna see any vibrant colors or anything like that. One thing that does catch my eye is that he's adding a green tint into the shadows of the image. We can basically see it constantly throughout his images, how the blacks, which would normally be neutral right here, they have a bit of a green tint, and he's adding this in the color grading department within Lightroom. And in some cases, he combines it with some magenta or some purple added in the bright points of our image, creating this very interesting combination of hues. Now, in other cases, more rare cases, he sometimes uses a teal color or a red, but most of the cases, he just uses the greens or the magentas, so we have to keep that in mind. And I almost forgot, finally he adds this very rough and very big grain in the image, reducing a bit of the detail, but just creating this analog-like feel to the image, and it's quite nice. We have to add that in the effects tab within Lightroom. So creators, in order for this video not to be too long, we're just going to create two presets today, the green variant and a magenta variant. So let's jump into Lightroom and start editing. But before that, as always, I have to remind you that these two presets that we're going to create today are included in the Edit-like preset pack v3. Link up here in case you want to check it out. In the Edit-like v3, you're going to find all the presets that we've created in the Edit-like series throughout this season. So it's a great way to skip all my tutorials, and in the process, you can support me. Also, just browse around my shop. Maybe there's something of interest to you. Will it be my personal presets that I use every single day to edit all my photos, or my LUTs that I use to edit my videos in a faster manner, just like this one. So if you can support me in that manner, I'm very thankful. So I continue to do videos for you guys because, well, we all know that YouTube AdSense, well, pays basically nothing. So if you can support me, I'm very thankful. If not, don't worry guys, let's jump into Lightroom and start color grading. So creators, here I am in Lightroom Classic, and I've selected an image and moved into the develop module. Now, don't worry if you're using another version of Lightroom or Camera Raw within Photoshop, it's exactly the same process because, well, Lightroom is the same, only the interface is a bit different. Now, this image that I've chosen over here is in New York after sundown, and as you can see, it's very contrasty. I exposed correctly or semi-correctly because I did compensate over here the exposure. The buildings at the back, but everything else that's in the shadow, it's very contrasty and losing a lot of information. This is what you can expect when you're shooting in blue hour. So first of all, what we want to achieve is the exposure and contrast. We want a flatter looking exposure. So for that, we're going to use the basic corrections in conjunction with the tone curve. So in the basic corrections, first of all, the shadows, we want to recuperate a bit of the information that we're losing over here by going not towards the negatives, but towards the positives. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go to the plus 100 because, well, this is completely unnatural. Maybe around the value of the 50% is going to be just enough. So we're achieving a bit more information in the shadows, but not too much. Then again, the highlights will control the bright points on our image. I'm going to drag them not towards the positives, otherwise we introduce more contrast, more towards the negatives, just around the minus 22. So our exposure is being flattened. Then whites and blacks are a bit different to highlights and shadows. Whites and blacks control the extremes on our exposure, the brightest points and the darkest points. Meanwhile, highlights and shadows are more in the middle ranges. So blacks, obviously I want to raise them up. So I'm not going to go towards the negatives, towards the positives to achieve more detail in the dark points on our image. The value is going to be plus 24. And then the whites, in this case, I'm just going to drag them ever so slightly up. Why? Because in most of Satoshi's images, the element that was most dominant was the sky. It was like the central subject. So right here, we want the sky to be our brightest point on our image and drawing the attention towards it. So a great way to do it is with lighting. So just going to drag it towards the bottom, not too much, but just drag it ever so slightly around the plus 12s just to brighten it up just a bit so it's more relevant. Okay, with Y on our keyboard, we can see what basic corrections has done, and we're basically just adding a bit more information into our image and flattening the exposure. Next, we're going to move down to the tone curve. Now, the tone curve, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically a similar tool to the basic corrections where you can alter the exposure and contrast, but it allows us to create more points or divide the image into more parts. As you can see in basic corrections, we only have 4 sliders. It's basically dividing our image into 4. Right here, we can add the amount of points that we want, so we can edit individual parts on our exposure. So this line that we have over here, or this curve, will act as the representation on our image and is overlaid in this graph. And if you drag any part of our image up, for example, this is the whites, so the highlights, when we drag it towards the positives, we introduce more brightness. If we drag it towards the negatives, we can darken them. So it's a very simple or intuitive way to use this tool, but it does take a bit of practice. Now, luckily for us, we're not going to use it too much. Right here, the first thing that I want to do is fade out those blacks. Remember that the blacks in the images of Metaphor 472 were very diffused or very white or very gray. So what I'm going to do is just move this point that will control the blacks. I'm going to move it not towards the negatives, towards the right. I was going to introduce more strength to the blacks. We're going to go towards the positives. So if I go ever so slightly higher, you can notice that the blacks basically disappear and they change into this gray. So I'm not going to go that high, but I am going to go maybe around. The value is going to be 28. Now, if you're not too sure where I placed it, you can always just select over here where it says output and type in 28, which is basically the coordinates in the y-axis. Input is going to be 0 because I didn't move it to the right or to the left. So right here, if you compare the blacks of our original photo with this one, you can see that they're more grayed out, exactly like we wanted them. Now, a consequence to that is that we're also losing a bit of the punch or the natural contrast of our shadow. So what I'm going to do is create a point in the shadow realm, which is this area. And I'm going to drag it just in the diagonal that we have as a reference. Maybe around these values, input is 58, output is 63, just returning a bit of the contrast to the shadows, whilst we're also just fading out those blacks. So this is before and after of the tone curve. This is before and after. Now we're just fading out those blacks, making our image a lot more gray and a lot more flat. Okay, so that's it for the exposure and contrast. Now let's move down to the colors. Now, before we move down into the more specific tools, we're going to use the vibrance slider that we have over here and just push it up towards the positives just to make our skies, which are going to be our most dominant colors on our image. Because if you're shooting like Satoshi, you're shooting towards the sunset, and shooting anything backlit to make the sunset a bit more saturated and vibrant. So as you can see, if I play around with the vibrance slider, it's moving the saturation around, but mostly it's pushing the colors which are central to our image, which are the oranges, the blues, and any color in the sunset. So I'm just going to go towards the positives to the plus 27. So that's the main difference between vibrance and saturation sliders. While saturation moves every color in the same amount, all of them, they move it respectively towards the positives or towards the negatives. Vibrance uses a bit of AI to detect which are the colors which are most important for each image, and to not affect them too much if you go towards the negatives, and to affect them a bit more if you go towards the positive. So that's the main difference between the two sliders. One is intelligent, the other is just straight out, just a dumb tool that moves all the values in an according manner. Okay, now we're going to move down to color mixer over here, which is previously known as HSL. So we're going to go into mixer, HSL, and right here we can change the hue, saturation, and luminance of each color. Now, right here, we're not going to move too much because, well, most of the images are shot at BlueHour, where the saturation isn't very high in the colors. We're not going to see any straightforward changes. what we are going to do is just change a bit of the values of the sunset. So first of all, in hue, right here, what I want to do is change the sky, which will sometimes veer more towards the aqua tones like this one. We want to go a bit more towards the positives to the cooler tones. So I'm going to go with a value around the plus 25 just to make it a bit darker. We're going to do the same with the magentas and the purples towards the warmer tones. Now, in this case, unluckily for us, this sunset doesn't have a lot of magentas, just has a bit of oranges and yellows. So we're not going to see the changes over here, even if I push around the sliders. But in the case that we are shooting a sunset that has a bit of purple or magenta, these changes are going to be a bit noticeable. So I'm just going to go again towards the positives, maybe around the same values, 26, and also the magentas 26. Again, in this image, it's not noticeable, but in other sunsets, it will be quite nice to see these changes. Next, in saturation, I'm just going to push the same colors, the same sliders a bit more to the positives, just pushing it a bit towards the 20s maybe, just to make the blues not too much, not too intense, but a bit around the 20 is going to be enough, I think. I'm going to do the same with the magentas and the purples. Now, the other color, which is very dominant in most of the sunsets, is going to be the oranges. So I'm just going to go, again, not too extreme towards the positives, but just a bit, 18% towards the positives. And right here, it's a very subtle change, but we can see the before and after. This is before and after, just adding a bit more saturation, very slight, into our sunset that we have at the background. Okay, next we're going to close color mixer, and down here we have color grading. And in this tool, well, it's very simple. We have 3 color wheels, one that controls the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights, and we can add a tint into a specific area. Remember that in Satoshi's images, most of the images had a bit of a green cast in the shadow. So right here, we can go into the shadow color wheel, add some saturation, and find the correct color. Now, remember that Satoshi had several variants. So right here, you can add maybe a purple, maybe a blue, maybe an aqua. In this case, I'm gonna go with a classic green. So I'm gonna find the hue, which I think is gonna be this one. The hue is gonna be 107 if you wanna type it in. And the saturation obviously is way too much, just gonna reduce it, maybe around 13%, so it's very dominant. You guys can play around and maybe go a bit lower. I almost forgot to mention this, guys, but the values that I'm inputting into the program are just tentative values. You guys can play around. Maybe you want it to be a bit more contrasty, just move the slider a bit more, or less saturated. You guys can play around. The values that I'm just introducing, take them as guides only. Okay, so right here we have our green tone. We can deactivate color grading to see what it's done. This is before and after, just adding this green cast into the shadows. Maybe it's a bit too intense, but I kind of like it. Maybe you guys can reduce the saturation just a bit. Okay, so this is the green preset. It's almost finished. We're gonna further along create the magenta one, but we are missing one thing, which is the grain. The grain was very noticeable in Satoshi's images. So what I'm gonna do is go into the effects tab over here. We're gonna emit vignetting for the moment, just gonna add some grain. So I'm just gonna zoom in just a bit to see what we're looking at. We have a very clean image, just a little bit of noise because it's a 320 ISO, but I'm just gonna push the quantity up. I'm gonna go around the 50%, so it's there, it's noticeable, but it's too small. So I'm just gonna raise up the size, something around these values. The value is gonna be 63, and now we have a very nice grain, as you can see. It's reducing a bit of the detail and sharpness of our image, but Satoshi isn't too worried about that. He's more interested in the look. So this is very similar to the grain that he has. And talking about detail and sharpness, we can go up into the presence tab and just reduce a bit of the texture and the clarity towards the negatives, not towards the positives. Otherwise, we introduce more contrast with clarity, and with texture, we introduce more digital sharpness. So I'm just going to go towards the negatives ever so slightly, -11 for the texture, for the clarity, around the same value. Okay, so the green preset is basically finished. Now we're going to save it, and then we're going to create the variant. So to save it, we're going to go to the left panel over here. Under presets, select the plus sign, create a preset, and right here we're going to name it, and we don't want to mark any of the things that we didn't use. For example, I didn't use exposure, white balance, and contrast. These three I like to leave them at 0, so you can apply the preset into another image and compensate the white balance or the exposure and the contrast. So I'm not going to mark them. We didn't use detail, and we didn't use vignetting or camera calibration, so I'll mark those, and then we're going to create it. Okay, we're going to test out the 2 presets in a couple of images to see if we did a good job or if we need to modify them, because it's always good to test out your preset on different situations, because it could be the case that your preset worked great for your image, your particular image, but in other scenarios it looks terrible. So it's always good to test them out. So before we do that, let's create the variant. So the variant is going to be the magenta one. You guys can play around with other colors, but in this case, I'm going to add it into the global color wheel. So I'm just going to add some saturation, maybe purples, no, towards the magentas. The hue is going to be around these values, 294, and saturation obviously is way too much, maybe around the 20%, which is a very high value. Now right here we have a bit of magenta creeping in, But one thing that is happening right here is that the magenta is being canceled out by the green that we added in the shadows. So as you can see, if I deactivate the shadows over here, double click, we can see now that our image does have the magentas that we added. If I return the greens, notice how our image is a bit more neutral. Why? Because greens are direct opposite to the magentas in the color wheel. As you can see over here, they're basically complementing each other and canceling them out. So you guys can play around. Maybe you want to leave the greens so they're mixing in. In this case, I'm just going to double click the shadows, so reset them. So we have a bit more of an emphatic magenta look in our entirety of the image. So this is looking quite nice. So with Y on our keyboard, you can see the before and after. Now we have those magenta hues in the shadows. So again, let's save this preset and now test them out in other images. Okay, so here I have this very contrasty image because it was shot at golden hour in Japan. So let's apply the presets. First of all, let's apply the green preset. As you can see, they're already in the Iraq preset pack, along with all the other presets that we've created throughout the series. The green one, and it looks fantastic. We can notice the change, notice the amount of information there is in the shadows in comparison to the original photo. We have a lot of detail. We have that very rough and very intense grain, and we have that green cast added in the shadows. I noticed the difference in the sky. In the original image, it was tending a bit more towards the aquas. Now it's a bit deeper towards the blues, the darker blues. Now let's see the magenta version. And it's very similar. It just works very nice. It looks fantastic with this magenta hue added into the entire image. Now it works quite nice because it's adding it into the shadows, to the midtones, but also into the highlights. And that magenta is just reinforcing a bit of the sunset colors in the sky. How about in this image? This one looks a bit underexposed to my liking of my friend Patricio, but let's apply the presets. First of all, the green. And we can notice how there's a lot more information in the shadows in comparison to the original. Option Alt to do your comparison in a vertical manner. And it's a shame that these sunsets that we have over here don't have any magentas or any reds or anything like that. They're very plain orange sunsets, but you guys can play around. But we have lots of information in the shadows, very nice grain. And let's see now the magenta one. And it looks fantastic, this one in particular. Notice the amount of magenta that appears in the shadows. It's very nice. It's creating a very nice looking retro image. Okay guys, so today I do think we did quite a good job. Our final results are very similar to the images that we saw in Satoshi's feed, so claps to us. But before I go, I want to remind you that these two presets are already in the Irelike Preset Pack V3, but also the Irelike LUT Pack V3. So I've reconverted all these presets into LUTs so you can apply them into your video as well. So browse around my shop, maybe you find my personal presets that I use every single day to edit my photos for Instagram, or my LUTs to edit videos like this one in a faster manner helpful. So if you can purchase anything from there and support me, I'll be very thankful. If not, don't worry guys, just like the video, share it maybe on social media or with a friend or a Facebook group. I'll be very thankful if you can support me in that manner. I'm Tony Fuentes, cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.